Welcome to the Goode Intelligence Identity Futures 2020 virtual conference. My name is Alan Goode, and I'm the founder and chief analyst at Goode Intelligence. Today in this future view with Daltrey, I'm joined by Blair Crawford, co-founder and managing director at Daltrey, who will be sharing his thoughts on biometric identity management. Welcome, Blair.
Thank you very much. Fantastic to be here.
Excellent. Can you kick us off by telling a little bit about yourself and about Daltrey?
Absolutely. So my background is in biometrics and identity management. For the last 6 or 7 years, I've been deploying biometric technology into high security federal and state-based government departments in Australia and New Zealand, but I've also done some work in the Middle East and in the UK. I'm sure you can tell my accent isn't a natural Aussie one. So I've done some projects back in the UK as well. So my background is predominantly around high security and the deployment of technology which can support authentication and overall identity needs for organizations. One of the big things that I focus on is how to improve the overall security and risk posture for organizations as it relates to identity strategy. So at Daltrey, what we focus on is a couple of things. The way that biometrics had actually been deployed into organizations over the last 10 to 15 years was in a very project-focused way. So what that meant from a technology perspective was that the solutions which were being developed were very good at solving particular problems in a particular area of an organization. With today's current cyber-physical security threat landscape, there had to be a different approach so that biometrics could be purchased as a capability by an organization and then deployed across any aspect of an operation that deemed it necessary to have that technology there. So the first thing we wanted to do at Daltrey was modernize the approach. I mentioned cyber physical there and the cyber physical environment. One of the main things that we're seeing from market right now is the need to converge the physical and logical security worlds. You know, the question is, why do we have a different credential to go in through a front door than we do to access our business applications? Let's fix that problem as well. And I think the other one where we really start to focus on helping our clients is around the disassociation between identity establishment and credential issuance. Why is it that when someone is onboarded into organizations that they don't necessarily have their credential for access issued at the exact same time? That is an inherent flaw in the overall process from a security and risk perspective. So we wanted to address that problem with Daltrey too.
Okay, thank you, Blair. I know that you have prepared a demo just to give us a flavor of what the Daltrey solution is. Is that possible? Can you share that now, please?
Absolutely. So I'm joined by one of my team members, James Berlin, who will be assisting us during the demo. While I speak, James will be following through. So what we're going to show here is what I touched on. It's the idea that you should be able to tie credential creation for authentication purposes to identity establishment, and then make your biometric available across varieties of operational use cases within your organization. And one thing I'd add on is that it should be made available as a service. Now, I don't mean traditional as a service from a commercial standpoint, as a service to the client. So whatever their infrastructure needs to be, whether it's on-premise or whether it's in the cloud, we wanted to build it to take into account those nuances of infrastructure requirement. So what we'll show first is, what you'll be able to see on the screen here is the Daltrey application. Now, what we've done is we've pre-provisioned an account for the team members, James Berlin. So we've pre-provisioned an account for James Berlin. James Berlin, let's just imagine, is a contractor. He is going to be remote, and because of the current situation, we're not going to get the opportunity to meet him face-to-face to do some ID checks before we bring him in to the organization. So in this particular example, we've pre-provisioned James's account with Okta. For those who don't know, Okta is a very large identity access management platform speciality in role-based access control for logical applications, and they also specialize in single sign-on. So we pre-provisioned this new contractor, James Berlin, into that system. But what we want to do is front-end the creation of his credential for access purposes with the Daltrey platform. So James, the user, has been asked to download the application, the Daltrey ID application. And we can kick off the process of establishing his ID by typing in an email address, by typing in a mobile number, or by scanning a QR code, whatever is appropriate. So if the user then has the ability to use an issued document to establish their identity. So in this case, we're going to use a passport. So we'll see here that James is going to take a picture of his passport document. We're looking for the MRZ code, which is the long string of letters and numbers down the left-hand edge. And once we have that, it allows us to create a secure session on the chip. Now, James is using an Android device for this particular demonstration, but we also support iOS devices, so you can get that full spectrum from a user-based perspective. So now we can extract the biographic information using the NFC from the passport chip. So once we have that biographic information, and this is the same process as you have happen at border control, once you have that information, we can start to do some matching. We can start to look at the text-based information and say, okay, does that information match the pre-provisioned account? Green tick. But what we're really looking to do now is say, okay, does the image which we've extracted from the passport match the person's face who's trying to create this credential in the first place? So James is going to take a selfie. So we can do the facial recognition match, but what's important here is that we also detect for presentation attacks. So we're going to do liveness checks. So the first liveness check that we'll do is an active liveness check. So James will follow the dot with his eyes, and we're looking for his eyes to follow the pattern that we would expect. Now, behind the scenes, and the most powerful piece is a passive liveness check. So it's a trained neural network. It's looking for anomalies created by masks, video playback, or animations. It's certified to an ISO standard to detect for presentation attacks. So if the algorithm and the technology is happy and the flow that we've put into place, James, the user, will be allowed to go and create his identity verified by a passport. We can also ping publicly available certificate databases so that we can check the veracity and the authenticity of the document. And we also have the ability to check to other identity sources just to check that ID and cross-reference the information we've got. Now, just quickly, what we'll do here is we'll say, James, the user, wants to log into their ID. But as an operating company, face is one of the biometrics which we support for authentication. But actually, for the role that James is going to be performing, they may want to add on a voice template, an iris template, or a fingerprint template. So at Daltrey, we've created a digital ID which can have all of the main biometric modalities used wherever a user needs to based on their role, whether that's in a physical access scenario or in a logical access scenario. So we can see here we've got face, fingerprint, iris, and voice. This is the mobile service app, but we can also have this deployed so that users can have operator oversight and enrolled at a workstation, for example. But for the purpose of the demo, we'll just say passport, self-service, and face is all James needs. So what James can now do is jump on to his workstation. It's his first day of a shift. It turns out that James was actually a contracting support engineer. So we can see here we've got Freshdesk on James's workstation. For those who don't know, Freshdesk, a very commonly used support ticketing service. The user wants to click login. Now, what we're going to do is show in this next screen is how we're connected into Okta. So Okta is going to interrupt the session to say, hey, you need to sign on to us first before we're going to give you access into your target application. So we can see here that Okta has been configured to use Daltrey ID as the primary authentication method. So the user can say, yep, I want to use that credential I just created with my mobile phone and my passport, but this time I'm going to take a selfie with my webcam. Again, we'll do a liveness check using the webcam to make sure that James is a real person. We'll convert that into a biometric template. We'll match that biometric template to the template which is now stored in the cloud as per the self-service onboarding, and we'll seamlessly and securely log James into his target application. Now, very powerfully, James can turn up to a physical location and use the same credential with his face to gain access to a building. The idea is one ID, no passwords, no access cards for any access scenario. So that's our demo.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, James.
Thank you, James.
So kind of a quick question on the integration to the physical access control systems, the PACs, that is done through like standard APIs that the PACs will have available, yeah?
Yeah, correct. One of the big things that happened recently was the standardization of interfaces and adoption of standard protocols across the industry. So if you look at the logical world, they were a little bit more advanced in terms of having OIDC deployed or OpenID Connect, but also very commonly use SAML interfaces. So it was easier or simpler to be able to connect. From a physical access control perspective, most of the large providers, in fact, all of the large providers will support REST APIs. Which gives us the ability to seamlessly connect into their environments and work with their existing workflows.
Okay, that's excellent. That's a game changer, really, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. There was a maturity in the market that had to occur across a number of things to make this possible.
Okay, thanks. So, what makes your identity management solution unique?
I think one of the big things that that we're certainly being told is not being done like us, is that converged physical and logical piece made available as a service, but also combining that with high-level identity assurance and liveness detection. There's some fantastic biometric capability out there, whether it's facial recognition algorithms or fingerprint algorithms or hardware devices. What the market was missing was a way to securely, privately, and with a fantastic user experience, pull all of those things together so that we could deliver these cyber physical environmental requirements which are out there now. I certainly think it's the combination of things which we've done, which is making us unique. Okay.
So can you tell us a little bit more? We hear that biometric identity as a service as banded around quite a bit. So can you tell me a little bit more about what that is, please?
I agree. The biometric as a service is one of those buzz phrases which tries to come up, and it's like blockchain and AI and all these other things. And until you wrap context around it, it really is just a buzz phrase or a buzzword. When we talk about it being made available as a service, we are talking about it from a functional perspective in the client eyes. It should be a technology which serves the client requirements from an operational perspective. So I think what we have done is made sure that we have architected our solution so that it can be called upon literally in any access scenario. Our development strategy was very clear: focus on APIs, focus on microservices, and focus on containerization. If you get that right, you truly can make biometrics a service. I think that we have the benefit of not suffering from any technical debt or any legacy-based software that we're having to pivot from to create something that achieves what it is the client wants to from an identity and biometric perspective. We have the benefit of a clean slate based on how the market has matured, and be very efficient in what it is we actually build.
Yeah, and that's a very important point. And from my experience, what we see is that a lot of the market for biometric identity verification and authentication is normally built around a sensor. So the manufacturers will have a sensor. It may be a high-end optical fingerprint sensor or an iris, and then they'll build a solution and service specifically around that one sensor. So there is, in my opinion, there seems to be few suppliers out there that have a mixture or a variety of biometric modalities that support in a single package, in a single solution. So I think that's a very good competitive advantage.
There's two key aspects to our solution. It's the digital credential with the assurance piece that we demonstrated there, but simply the biggest gap in the market was that middleware piece. Being able to bring together these otherwise disparate pieces of technology and making them work with an existing ecosystem. Rip and replace, no one wants to rip and replace anything. You need it to work with that which you've already invested in. And that's the majority of our investment, to be honest, making that work and making it slick. I think there's another key part to that as well, which is that needs to be considered. An identity or a biometric identity provider, when you have full control around the capture from a device perspective, how the biometric template is then treated in transit and then how it's stored, it gives you the best opportunity to nail the security requirements and the compliance requirements. I don't believe there's any other way to do it securely and privately than if you have complete control over the biometric journey. And then when it comes to authentication, only pass authentication tokens down to applications on a need to know basis. They don't need to know, their target application doesn't need to know James Berlin. It just needs to know someone has turned up that has the appropriate level of authentication to do something. So it's a bit of a shift in that regard.
Okay, yeah, well put. In the demo, we saw quite a number of biometric modalities that were supported by the application. Which biometric modalities do you support? And also, is there what kind of use cases? So where is iris better than fingerprint, etc. So
yep. So we're certainly seeing a lot of interest and action around face at the moment. Amazing user experience. The maturity of the algorithms has significantly increased. But I think the liveness detection is very important because the corporate perimeter has been blown away this year. The front line of corporate security is everyone's dining room or spare bedroom or whatever it is now. And they're at a much higher level of there is a much higher level of sensitive information now needing to be accessed on a higher frequency than ever before from people's homes, for example. So being able to tie that liveness piece into the authentication workflow is allowing for more complex and highly sensitive transactions to be completed with the traditional perimeters. I think what we're also seeing though is you've got to take into consideration, the right technology for the right application. In a data center, iris is still preferred for many of the organizations that we work for. It has a very low false accept rate, highly improbable that it's going to make a mistake. But in saying that, face, it's highly improbable that it's going to make a mistake if you use the right algorithm, the right hardware, and the right other base context authentication criteria. I think in terms of your question, what modalities do we support? Because we've taken this approach of creating a digital ID, which is really just a digital representation of your physical self. Out of the box, we support voice, face, iris, and finger. But we also support algorithms which do behavioral analytics. So that's about continuous authentication, making sure that the person who is authenticated into a session is still the same person that's actually operating the session. Then that's certainly not for everyone. It's certainly not for every use case. You've got to be very careful to not cross the monitoring line as well and the user privacy piece. But in some circumstances, being able to detect whether a mouse is now moving in a different way is useful, especially if you're trying to detect whether a person has taken over a session that you thought was authenticated by an approved user.
Okay, thank you. So who do you work with? And I mean that as in terms of partners and partners who you can actually tell us about, and also from a client perspective.
Well, the thing with biometrics in a lot of these circumstances is it's high security and all hush hush. So generally it's government, it's these high security deployments where you've got national security drivers, you've got high risk in terms of citizen data, and you need to protect with an appropriately capable authentication method. So government is definitely a big proponent of biometrics and this approach to it. Then the other one which has come on right now, and Australia was recently there was a cyber attack on the country. You know, whether it was a nation-based sponsored cyber attack or otherwise, the nuances of it doesn't really matter in that it was still attacked by some entity. Now, one of the things that came to the forefront in that regard was critical infrastructure. Given that everyone was working from home and given that we were under cyber attack, the quickest way to disrupt the machinery of society is to turn off the power and to turn off the internet. And in that regard, I think we're seeing a lot of interest and posture change from the critical infrastructure providers because they are target number one. There's certainly been a lot of work in Australia to highlight the risks and to assign budget to bringing the overall posture of these entities up. Maybe your traditional ones as well, you know, banking and finance, especially around the know your customer piece, and then being able to turn the established identity into the authentication method. Fantastic for security, fantastic from user experience perspective. And data centers itself being that front line of protection, whether you're remote accessing into a data center, you know, the liveness piece again, or whether you're physically entering a data center, you'll be hard pushed to find one that doesn't use biometrics, at least in the physical, for physical access control.
Okay, thank you. So can you explain your vision about a single identity for both physical access control and digital authentication?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's driven this whole business when I started it as a really passwords. No one really likes passwords and access cards to an extent, but I think the idea that you should be able to have an amazing user experience to go on with your role was that fundamental driver and how to make that better when it came to using biometrics. I think the other thing though is that there is a need right now to help organizations improve their security posture and to take into account I mentioned it before, the current cyber physical risk environment. So my vision in that regard is to have organizations be able to buy the capability where they can have a single ID with a set of trusted users. They can then go about their job in a very easy way from an authentication perspective, and that our technology just sits passively in the background and allows people to do their roles securely and safely. Of course, we would like to see in certain circumstances that we become, the default. Our approach to biometrics and the combination of technology that we're bringing together to enable, that amazing user experience, private experience as well, protection of data and secure. I would like to see our approach be, the standard. We're going to publish a document next year because I don't think it's very well documented right now, but we will publish our contribution to an end-to-end management of a biometric to market, and it will take into account the treatment, I call it the treatment of the biometric, all the way from capture to how it moves in transit, how it's protected in transit, and then ultimately how it's stored. And it will also take into considerations for now, but it will also look at what the future of identity is in terms of self-sovereign. So yeah, there's quite a lot there, but my vision is to contribute and have Daltrey as a major player, if not the major player, in defining the standards for the end-to-end treatment of biometrics for government and enterprise.
Okay, that's an excellent vision, and I think that leads us nicely onto the next question, which is about biometric standards. And I think you touched on a very good point about education. I think it's improving in terms of the buyer community, and that there's more knowledge, but there's still, I find when I'm engaging with end users, buyers, that there's still quite a bit of education to do in terms of the metrics involved in assessing biometric systems. So what standards should a buyer be looking at when assessing a biometric identity and authentication system?
My opinion is that biometrics either works or it doesn't. There are enough algorithms out there and enough competition in terms of publicly referenceable performance criteria to see what works and what doesn't in different situations. I think that a lot of the algorithms which are out there for face, for example, will do a job to a certain level. You start to see the incremental gains when you have huge population samples, you know, because quite a lot of them are on a par. So to your question more specifically, you need to look at the ISO standards for the liveness detection. You need to look at the false accept rates, false reject rates, and failure to enroll information. You know, we use NIST. We like to look at the performance criteria. I believe if you have an algorithm and you're not publishing or entering those NIST competitions for performance, then that's odd. I would be if I was writing algorithms, because that's really where you can shine. So NIST, ISO, and I think the other one, which is a little bit more complex and where we are trying to influence the standards, it's that end-to-end treatment piece. It's about how you actually define, you know, when you should store an image as opposed to a biometric template, if ever. It's how you know, what encryption methodologies are appropriate. What is the embedded software requirement that should sit on a piece of hardware in order for you to have complete control of capture at the edge? And these things are a little bit vague because you have so many people contributing to hardware development, for example. So, you know, there are certain standards that would be in there, but yeah, my big thing right now is it's the end-to-end piece. So stand by for us to contribute to that in the not so distant future.
That's an excellent idea. So finally, from a demand perspective, where are you seeing demand for biometric systems, and what applications are currently popular or important?
Yeah, so government, absolutely. Authentication into the physical areas of government, you know, offices, data centers, the traditional use case. I think the one that's maturing quickly though is the logical access. So into the having an established biometric credential to be able to authenticate into the Office 365 environment. So we're just deploying for a client, goes live on Monday for another client. Liveness detection for remote workers across Australia, Singapore, and the Czech Republic. Authentication into the Office 365 environment and also into the Atlassian environment. And it's all about protecting intellectual property and sensitive client data. So that's not necessarily a specific industry vertical. And I think that's what we're starting to see overlap in. It's instead of saying it's banking and finance, or I mentioned critical infrastructure or insurance, whatever it might be, what we're seeing in terms of the adoption of our technology is a profile of risks. So it's highly regulated industries, significant risks so far as being targeted by cyber criminals because they hold large amounts of sensitive information, hugely distributed workforce, and yeah, I mean, I think those are the main drivers right now, and they exist across multiple industries. And you just look at the list of hacks that have occurred recently. I think the other thing that we'd say is that the clients that we're bringing on board have a relatively mature identity strategy. They've adopted the position to say that we can no longer treat logical and physical as separate things. We need to look at convergence across because they're one and the same. And they've already probably adopted, you know, a privileged access management solution. They've already got an identity access management solution. They've probably got only one or two physical access providers. I think they're the most, you know, when we see those types of things happening, those organizations are ready to bring this level of authentication into their stack.
Are you seeing, following on from that, are you seeing organizations, is it a migration from the low risk users into, multi-factor authentication using biometrics, or is it going for the the more higher risk be that the users who are currently maybe using tokens and other forms of two-factor authentication?
They've already got two-factor. What they're doing is they're swapping us in as the primary factor.
Okay. Interesting.
So the way that, you know, if you look at some of the biometric options which are out there as part of a multi-factor strategy, you've got, so say you've got your username and password, and then you use Face ID, for example, on a mobile, on a soft token, as the second factor, for example. The obvious problem with that is that there was no establishment necessarily completed to assign the user who enrolled the biometric on their iPhone to the user who you actually think is using the credential. So what we're seeing is that, well, let's drop that type of MFA, having the biometric as a kind of bolt on, and instead actually create the biometric as the primary and tie it closely to an identity. And then where we're required, we'll actually have other context-based authentication wrapped in. So that might be, you know, geolocation, or it might be soft token on the mobile still, or it might just be registered devices. But we're always starting with the biometric.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, Blair, this has been a really, really great session. Thank you. If anybody wants to learn more about your company, what's the best way to contact you and to find out more?
You can jump onto our website, www.daltrey.com. We also have a podcast where we're providing industry insights. So you can catch us on, if you go into iTunes or Spotify, Identity Today. On Twitter, our handle is @DaltreyID, or you can just email us, hello@daltrey.com. There's a variety of options.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. So thank you for your time today, and stay safe. Thanks.